All right, we're live. Hello and welcome to another session with Okta's developer relations teams. We're going to get started in a minute here. We're going to make sure everything's all set up and give people some time to join.
And so it's a nice cool morning in my neighborhood. Is it nice weather out there in New Hampshire, Brian?
So far, yeah, it's yesterday was nice too. It's been hovering right around 70, mid 70s, Fahrenheit. So I'll take that any day. I wish the summers were 70 degrees and the winters were like 20 and I'd be pretty
Right.
happy.
That'd be
The
great for
reality is
sure.
it's not like that. It's like summers are closer to 90, 100 and the winters are like 0 or 10 below.
Right. Here in Colorado we get, June is beautiful. And then after that it's definitely can warm up. So if you're in the chat, let us know where you're from, where you're listening from today, and we want to make this fully interactive. So instead of, me just being the talking head with a presentation here, we want to answer your questions and see what you have to say and make this so it's not just a normal virtual presentation.
Yeah, so far we've got one person from New Hampshire. So that's great. One
Nice.
one other person from New Hampshire, I should say, right?
Right?
The other comment from Eric is there's too much pollen. So there is a ton of pollen right now. If you have allergies, it is not the time to be hanging out outside.
Oh, what we have here in Colorado is a lot of moths. The moths have like taken over. So if you actually like leave your windows open or anything like that, like it can all of a sudden the next morning you'll be like, where'd they all come from? And so much so that there was something on the news recently that was like, if you're having a problem with moths, turn your lights off. Right? Which is pretty good advice.
Yep, I've got a young puppy, and it's hard to train, or it's been hard for us to train the dog to go in and out the door quickly. I mean, in the wintertime, we're trying to
Right?
do that too. It's like, hurry up, get in. But now it's like because of the moths. So the lights go on to let the dog in or out, and then the moths, fly through the window and or through the door, and yeah, it's a hard time. It hasn't been
I got
excessive though, so I don't know. I don't know what to do for you.
All right, we got Thiago coming in from Barcelona here. Hello, Thiago.
Oh,
Hopefully, I'm
nice.
saying your name right. And then Amin there. Good to see you. We'll wait a few more minutes to let some more folks roll in. We know how developers are. We like starting on time, but we don't always do it.
All right, so who's the in the chat so far while we're waiting? Who has the earliest time zone, or maybe the latest time zone? What do we have for the extremes here?
All right, we're at 6 o'clock Denver time here, 6 a.m.
Yeah, I'm at eight a.m. I can answer for Eric. I'm pretty sure Eric's in the same time zone. The Canary Islands. Look at that.
I mean, they're tuning in on vacation.
Right? Yeah. Is that a vacation or is that where you normally are? All right, we got a two p.m.
That's like
and
Paris time, right? That was our original goal because this was a miss from Devox France, right? So
yep,
that's
GMT.
working. We got a 5:30 p.m. from India. I love the half, right? Time zone that India has.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like, we're
Half
just
hour
gonna split
difference.
the difference. Just I like the mentality. Don't cater to one side or the other. It's just everybody's just kind of you gotta compromise, right? It's
Right.
5:30.
I should have got a cooler coffee cup. You got one with like family pictures on it and
Oh,
everything?
my wife, like every year she makes these things, from Shutterfly. We should get a product plug here. But she sends them out as Christmas gifts, as like my parents have them, her parents have them, my sisters, like everybody's got a coffee mug with our faces on it. So usually it's
Nice.
my kid's face, but I guess the whole family's on this one.
Nice. So we're at about 5 minutes. You think we should get started or chat a little more?
Yeah, let's give it another minute and then we'll get rolling here.
Okay, maybe we can ask for who's fans of what or who's using what in the chat. Like, are you using Quarkus or Spring Boot or Helidon or what's the other
Oh,
Micronaut?
yeah, we should have had one of those poll systems set up and we could have polled everybody. I'll just have to
Well,
keep count.
well, it's interesting. I posted a few videos right in the last few weeks doing like building REST APIs, basically taking like part of the demo from this and doing it for each individual framework. And it's just interesting to see how many likes you get on ones versus the others, right? Like Spring Boot, super popular, right? Helidon, not so much, right? And you kind of
Yep.
just see that when you post and promote the videos, how many people are into them.
Yeah, well, I think Spring has in the comparison probably has an unfair advantage just being sort of the incumbent, right? Just being around longer.
Right, 8 years. 8 years is forever, right?
For
In
for
technology,
for
like
Boot has been around for 8 years.
yeah, 2014,
Oh wow, wow, that is forever.
right? And to last that long, like even JavaScript frameworks, right? Like those were a flash in the pan for a while there too, and a lot of them have been around forever as well. I do have a slide I will talk about, like the founding dates on each framework because I do think it's interesting, and yeah, I think you're right that Spring Boot has a not really an unfair advantage, but an
Right,
advantage. But then
right,
when it
right,
comes to
right.
native, like the other ones have an advantage because they were like, we started with native.
That's a good point. Yep. We should talk about that. Maybe do do a
Maybe we do
presentation.
a presentation on it.
Yeah, let's roll into that.
All right,
All right.
let's
So
get
so
it going.
while you're loaded, we did have someone for Quarkus, a couple for Spring Boot, actually a couple for Quarkus and a couple for Spring Boot. So low data set, but we've got some fans.
Nice.
All right, let me set you up here, Matt, and hide me, and let's get rolling.
All right. So welcome everyone to native Java REST API comparison. If you know me, you might remember my web framework comparison from back in the day. The first time I ever did that was 2004, and I actually carried it all the way through like 2011 or 12. So that was my longest running presentation. And with any luck, maybe this one will be a long running presentation as well. And the reason I'm bringing this to you today is because I was supposed to present it at Devoxx France back in April. I think the last time I updated the presentation was April 19th, and that fell through. I got COVID from the Frozen Four. So that's the NCAA hockey championship where my school, the University of Denver, actually won. So that was fun. But the week following and the several weeks following was not. So I'm over that. Good to go. No long COVID yet. So life is good. And the image in this photo is actually from my wife, Trish McGinnity. She took it when we were out at a Devoxx France in the past. And so that's why I wanted to put it there. So who am I? Well, I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water, and I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day. But in the winter, we got to ski. So that was, a lot of fun. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, and awesome kids, Abby and Jack. You can tell this photo is a bit dated because Jack on the left there is now taller than me by a good 6 inches. So we definitely need to do a new, family shot there. And Brian, if you have any questions from the audience or everything, feel free to pipe in and ask me. That's why we're doing it this way. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and it took 12 years to make him look like this. And he's got a Porsche engine, and boy, is he fun to drive. I also have another Volkswagen. His name is Stout. So you can see I have an expensive obsession with classic Volkswagens and Vanagons. If you have a similar problem, hit me up in direct messages and on Twitter or matt.rabel@okta.com. I'd love to talk to you about it. So I work for a company called Okta, as does Brian. When I first started, my dad called it Okra, and now he's still not to Okta. He's at Okta now. So good grief, Dad. Come on. I think maybe he's just joking with me these days, just to see if he can get a rise out of me. You're probably aware that we joined forces with Auth0 back in about a year ago, and Eugenio Pace is their CEO. And I knew I liked the guy when I read in his bio that in his spare time, he enjoys the outdoors, rowing, riding bikes, spending time with his family. and restoring his 1970 Carmen Ghia. Right? So I don't know if he knows that I have a bus yet, but we're going to be good friends, like maybe even best friends. Right? So that's a lot of fun. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about why you should use Java. So I think the first time I did this presentation, it was more at a non-Java venue. So, there's always some convincing of why people should use Java over other frameworks. And then I'll show you how to build REST APIs with Java. I'll talk a bit about GraphQL and how you can use that to build APIs as well. And then how to secure your APIs with OAuth 2.1. You might notice that I'm saying 2.1 instead of 2.0. And then build with Docker, and then how to go native with GraalVM. So there's many companies invested in Java. If you're new to the industry, you might not be aware, but Netflix, eBay, IBM, Microsoft, Okta runs on Java, VMware, Tesla, Apple. Like there's a lot of companies that have used Java to build their very successful businesses. So 25 years of use, abuse, and improvements. It's open source. Hasn't always been open source, but it has been for, almost 2 decades, at least a decade now, and hugely popular and widely used. So if you want to get started with the latest and greatest, that's Java 18. You can download the Oracle builds of OpenJDK. They're at jdk.java.net, or Eclipse builds from Adoptium. So there's also even a better way than that, and that is with SDKman. So SDKman basically allows you to install a bunch of different, Java development kits or software development kits, not just Java. There's Groovy, Scala, Kotlin, Ceylon even, Ant, Gradle, Grails, Maven, SBT, like all kinds, right? So it's very easy to just do SDK install Java. And then if you don't specify a version, I think you'll get the latest LTS, which is 17.0.2 from Tamarin. And that's Adoptium's new name. So it used to be I forget what it is. Eclipse Adoptium or whatever is now the name. I forget what it even was before that. I don't know if you remember, Brian, but now the new name is Tamarin. So I think they really, they kind of messed up on that, because why pick T when you had A? They were like A before at Adoptium. So if you do SDK list Java, you'll actually see all the list of JDKs you can install, and T is way down at the bottom. So they could have done better there, but it works great. So really love SDKman there. And Java 18 represents the 9th feature release as part of the 6-month cadence. So, you might have seen in the Java world, people complain about Node, releasing so often and having a new release, every 6 to 12 months. Well, guess what? We do that now too in Java land. So you can see people starting to complain about Java's frequent releases. And the cool thing is it's like a train at a station, right? That there's always every 20 minutes a new train. You don't have to get on if you don't want to. You can just wait for the next one. So for over 3.5 years, the level of predictability allows developers to more easily manage their adoption of innovation thanks to a steady stream of incremental and expected changes. I did get that from Oracle, so little marketing in that slogan there, or that sentence. And then in this slide, you can see that there's JEPs. These are called JDK enhancement proposals. These weren't introduced until Java 10. So the vertical legend that you see on the left, the features, can be a bit deceiving because they were simply features, and then since then they're JEP. So it looks like there's more happening in the older releases, and there probably was, but now there's a steady stream of smaller incremental things. And so this talk was originally inspired by a blog post from Daniel Parida on the Okta developer blog. And so he showed you how to build, Java REST APIs and how easy it was. But you can see it's also from early 2020. And so it wasn't always too easy to build, REST services in Java until Spring came along and changed the landscapes. And since then, there's many new frameworks, right? That's where we get into, things like Grails came along, and that really made it a lot easier. And then there's Quarkus, and then Red Hat, supports that and delivers fast startup time and less memory usage with it. And so we've really got a plethora of frameworks to choose from now. And so I wrote another post because, 2020 is kind of old, last year in June of 2021, and it shows REST APIs and also shows you how to build them each as a native app. And then I got some complaints from people, actually not really complaints, just, requests that I add Helidon. So I wrote another one with Helidon, and I did it as a standalone post. And the reason I did it standalone without combining the three was I got some advice from Josh Long, who was like, if you're doing a post about comparing Spring Boot and Micronaut and Quarkus wins, well, the Spring Boot people aren't going to promote it. And so, hey, he's right. So I decided, to do one standalone for Helidon. And so you might be wondering, when it comes to native Java frameworks, like who cares about startup time? Serverless is just someone else's computer, right? Can't you get around that by just leaving your servers running and your JVM war? Yes, but with pay per usage, serverless can save big companies a lot of money. And when you're big, you don't want money, flying out the window. And so to get started with the first one, and there's an order to these, the reason I chose Micronaut first was because when I first did this, back in June of 2021, it was the easiest, right? I never really had to change anything from its default starting instructions, and everything just worked. So you can use SDK SDK install Micronaut. That will install the latest version at the time of this presentation. That's 3.5.1. And then you run mn create app, specify your package name, and then your features. So you might notice that I have -b Maven for the build tool. And most people that use Micronaut probably will not use Maven. And so I do get frequent complaints from the Micronaut folks that, I should be using Gradle because it's better. But also by using Maven, I found a couple bugs in their Maven implementation of their plugin. So it's a win-win, I think. -f for security JWT that lets you set up an OAuth 2 resource server so we can secure our REST API. And then the Micronaut AOT is an enhancement that they recently added to do the native builds a bit faster and a bit more optimized when they start up. So if you're not really, a command line person, you're more of a visual person, you can also use Micronaut launch. So just one thing to note, if you use Micronaut for a name, that does not work. They don't allow that. But otherwise, you select your application type, your Java version, your base package, and then your build tool and all that kind of stuff. And then you can see that I also selected a feature there, security JWT. And then you can build a REST controller. You see there's a good chunk of imports that you need, but then you just specify your controller, and then you can secure it with the secured annotation. And then you say it just produces, plain text. And what we're doing here is we're just going to return the user's name because we want to prove that they've authenticated. And so if you passed in a JWT that's valid and it was able to read it and, confirm that everything's okay, then it would print out your name. And then for Micronaut JWT security, you need to enable it, and then you provide a URL to the public keys so you can verify the signatures of the JWT. So that's a JSON web key set, JWKS, that contains the public keys that can be used to verify the signature of the tokens that you receive from the authorization server. So those keys can be used locally to validate the JWTs without making a call to the server every time. So very efficient. So you can see this is a properties-based version. If you create a new Micronaut app, you'll actually get an application.yaml by default. So, obviously that would be much longer. The reason I use properties here is much shorter and it fits on a slide. So, if you're not familiar with JWTs, you can see there's basically, it's a long string with a couple dots in it. The first section is the header. The second section is the claims, and then the final section is the signature. And that's just a base 64 encoded string. So if you unencode it, it's just JSON, and then you can validate it using that signature. And so to test it after you've built that API, you can use HTTPie, which is one of the hardest things I've learned how to say. I usually say like HTTPIE or HTTPie, right? So it's a better curl. I suggest you install it. Works really nice. You can get it from httpie.org. So you just install it using something like brew, and then you can run HTTP and to a URL, and it'll return a nice color-coded view of that. You can also use put, post, and get as the default, and it returns and sends JSON by default as its content type. So works really nicely that way. So to test this API that you've built with Micronaut, with HTTPIE, first of all, you'd start it with mn run. That's the Maven plugin that they use. And then you hit that endpoint, and it will return a 401, right, because you're not logged in. And then specify the token, and then specify the token when using HTTPie. So that'll come back and print the user's name. And you can see what it looks like in this screenshot there, the 401 in the beginning, and then specifying that token and getting that, passing it in with HTTP. So you might be wondering, how do I get that access token? Well, at the demo part, I'll show you, but long story short, it's oidcdebugger.com. You can go there and set it up to actually get an access token from whatever authorization server you're using, whether it's Okta, Auth0, maybe even Keycloak or Spring authorization server. You should be able to use it with all of them. So that's Micronaut. And then moving on to Quarkus. In this example, I'm using 292, and that's the latest version, unless they released a new version this morning that I'm not aware of. And they have basically a Maven archetype that you can use. So you start out with a group ID, artifact ID, class name just for your hello resource, or whatever you want the default endpoint to be. And then you give it a path, and then you specify the extension. So if you don't specify any extensions, you do get rest easy reactive, but you don't get small right JWT. So that's why I added both of them in here. And then if you're more of a visual person, they also have a browser-based starting code at code.quarkus.io. So you can see there again, you specify your group, your artifact, your build tool, and your Java versions, and then you can select, the different extensions you want to use. And so just like Micronaut, handful of imports, but the what do you call them? Annotations, right, are a little bit different. So path, which is standard from JAX-RS, and then get standard as well, and then authenticated, that is a Quarkus annotation, and then produces that text plane, and then they have a security context that you can get the principal from and print out their name. And so they actually use microprofile JWT security. And so the long name is microprofile JWT RBAC security specification, or MP-JWT. And so there's a link at the bottom if you want to read more about it. But the interesting thing here is they specify, a public key location and an issuer, right? And those are the main keys that you need to use. And so the public key location, again, that's JWKS. And then the issuer, I'm not sure what the relationship is between them as far as microprofile is concerned, but I do like to do a little rant here, because if you have that issuer and you go to it and you go to / or .well-known after the issuer / OpenID - configuration, the JWKS URI is right there. So you should only need an issuer. You shouldn't need both of them, right? It's kind of duplicate. And maybe they're not looking up the JWKS URI. They're just, having you specify it so they don't have to look it up. But I think there's a better way. Spring security just requires an issuer. It doesn't require that JWKS URI, but maybe it's a performance optimization. So then to test it with HTTP, same thing. You start with Quarkus Dev, and Quarkus Dev is actually one of the coolest startup experiences or development experiences I've seen, because Spring Boot has their dev tools, but you have to recompile the classes in order for it to re-initialize and restart. And so if you're using Eclipse, you're used to that. That's not a big deal. You just save the class and it restarts, right? But if you're using IntelliJ, you have to go and configure it to recompile it by default. And so a little bit of work there. But with Quarkus, it picks up anytime you save a file and reloads the application. And so that's a great developer experience. You hit it with, HTTP without an access token, and it'll return a 401. You hit it with one, and it does it. So, just to show you a visual of that again, shows you the 401, very concise on its response. And then when you hit it with the token, it comes back with your full email. And so then getting started with Spring Boot, you can use start.spring.io. And so they have their actual, website at start.spring.io that you can use, but also you can use an API and hit it. So that same website has a starter.zip endpoint. I think there's a TGZ one as well. So you could hit that one and get, a TGZ file, but you specify the dependencies, the package name, the name of your app, the type, and the base directory, and boom, you got everything. And then, of course, if you want to do it in a browser, you can do that as well. The thing I like about the browser-based version is you can actually click on the Explore button and you can see what the code looks like. So that's a great way to compare what you have with how they configure things there. And you can also click the Share button and actually send it to someone else, and then they will get all the same settings. So that's pretty slick. But also with the HTTP version, you can do that too. So if you look at the Spring controller, it's the most concise, right? But it's got the longest package name. So they've also, had a while to perfect things. But it requires the least amount of code if you're just, counting lines of code. It's very simple with the REST controller and the get mapping there. And then it just uses the regular Java Security Principal, and gets the name from that. And then one thing the Spring folks have suggested, if you're using Spring Native and building GraalVM images, is to optimize Tomcat for Spring Native. So basically excluding the embed core and embed WebSocket and including the embed programmatic. And so I think, you know, as Spring Boot 3 comes out and Spring Framework 6, this will likely go away, but there's probably Tomcat optimizations that are being made that allows it to go away. And so I used OAuth 2 resource server when creating the app, but you can also use Okta. We have our own Spring Boot starter that you can use instead. And our Spring Boot starter basically combines Spring Boot starter security, Spring Security OAuth 2 client, Spring Security OAuth 2 Jose, and Spring Security OAuth 2 resource server. So in this example, we're just using resource server, but it requires a bit more configuration. The cool thing about our actual plugin is you only need the one line. So you just specify the issuer. And with the Spring Security OAuth 2 resource server, that's all you need as well, but the properties are a little longer. So when we get to the demo, I'll show you that part. But, you know, it works really nicely. And in my time, you know, developing like this sample, one of the cool things that's happened is all these frameworks weren't as optimized as they could be. I think Quarkus and Micronaut were, but Spring Security actually used that issuer and did a lookup of all the endpoints on startup. So in a serverless environment, you don't really want that, right? You want things to start up super fast and maybe on the first request do that lookup. And so they did actually change that based on, you know, the feedback that we found. So testing it is the same. Start it up with their plugin, and then you hit that hello endpoint, and then you pass in the token. And the cool thing about Spring Security is look at those security headers, right? They're returning a ton. Even if you know, get a 401, they're doing all the content length and cache control and keep alive and, you know, setting cookies and all that. So that's a lot more than you saw from the other frameworks. And then also, you know, hitting it with a bearer token gives you a lot more protection, right? Like those are default like CSP kind of things in there with the X content type options, no sniff, and the X frame options, deny, and all that. And so now to look at the last one, Helidon, right? This is a little latecomer to, you know, the field of all these frameworks. It's mostly standards based, just like Quarkus, right? It uses JAX-RS and the microprofile standard when it can. It's also from Oracle. So what I've seen is there's a lot of people using it, but I think there's probably a lot of customers from Oracle that are using it more so than like the general open source community. And so, and they had a late start, but to get started with Helidon, you can use their archetype. You see that -U is just to get the latest version, and then the interactive mode to turn that off. And then you're just specifying, you know, the group ID, the artifact ID, the version, and then, you know, other things for your actual application. So one of the things that I've learned is they do have a 3.0 that's, I think, M2 that's out, but it's Java 17 and up. So Spring Boot 3 will do something similar, and I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, Quarkus might do that in their version 3, where, you know, you have to use Java 17 as a baseline. That makes it a lot nicer for the frameworks themselves to develop it because they can use a lot of the new features. And so there's also a Helidon CLI that you can use, and you can use Helidon init to actually start your app up. And then there's also a Helidon dev command, so it's similar to the other, you know, listening commands that will restart your app if you change anything. So the Helidon init looks like that and works pretty nicely. I did notice, just to warn you, if you use the archetype versus the CLI, they do produce different like apps, even though they should be the same. So I did let them know that, but I don't think they fixed it. But then if you want to do an actual, you know, REST endpoint, you can import from their, you know, security packages, and then the rest is JAX-RS. And then you specify the path to your resource, you specify get, and then you return the principal from that. So the signature of that hello method looks very similar to Quarkus. I don't know if they had a context in there, but then, you know, you get the name from that. So a little bit different. And then you also have to register that resource in a main hello application class, or you can call it whatever you want. It just needs to extend application. You need to specify your login config there, and then you need to specify application scope. And so what I noticed when playing with the Helidon 3 stuff is you don't need this class. So they figured out, you know, how to optimize and make sure that they register it automatically for you. And you notice the other frameworks don't require any sort of registration either. So then how do you configure security with Helidon? Well, you need to go into source main resources, meta-inf, and microprofile-config.properties. And there's a dependency you'll need to add for JWT. And then in that config file, you'll need to specify the issuer and the public key location. And again, this is, microprofiles JWT. So they're the ones who specify, these keys and make you specify the issuer and the public key location. And then testing is a bit more difficult. If you're not using the CLI, you do have to package first, right? There's no like plugin to actually start it up or anything like that. So MVM package and then java-jar and point to that target/helidon.jar and then hit it with HTTPIA and hit it with a token. And so here's what it looks like. Pretty, standard, not a lot of security headers like Spring Security, but, works pretty nice. And as long as you've set everything up, you'll get a response back. And so now the part that people are interested in, right? Like, what about the performance? So this is the performance check that I did on April 19th with Micronaut 342, Quarkus 281, Spring Boot 266, and Helidon 250 on my M1 Max, right? The new Apple Silicon. So I ran it 3 times and I took the last one. So with Micronaut, I used the Maven plugin. With Quarkus, I used their plugin, and I wasn't actually packaging the jar and running them that way. So that's the dev startup part, is just doing it with Maven. And you can see there that Micronaut starts up the fastest. So if you're just doing day-to-day development, you'll have that fast startup. But then Quarkus, right, it always listens for changes. So it's really like a one-time thing. The others have that listening ability as well, depending on how you configure things. And then if you package them and start it with java-jar, you can see that Micronaut is the fastest, and Quarkus is closely behind it. So what about GraphQL APIs, right? I show you how to create a REST API. I used to recommend GraphQL Speaker for Spring Boot, but now they actually have GraphQL support right in Spring Boot. So the reason you might want to use GraphQL is because if you have, a REST API, at some point you probably are going to get into your clients wanting to filter data or not return, the bulk of data. So when I worked at LinkedIn back in 2008, we struggled with this, and we ended up using like query parameters, right, in the REST API call to, return a light view. Like the default was a light view, and then you could get a heavy view. And, at some point they probably had a 2/3 view or something like that. But GraphQL will allow you to just specify what you want when you make the call. So it was invented at Facebook, and they have many different clients for, their APIs. And so that's how it kind of came to be. And it's one of those things that I've seen people hate on until their framework has support for it. And then they're like, wow, it's awesome. I love it. And so of these frameworks, who supports GraphQL? Well, Micronaut does. You can find their guide at that URL. Quarkus does with small-i GraphQL. And then Spring Boot, like I said, just added Spring GraphQL. And so that was from the GraphQL Speaker project. And Speaker stands for GraphQL Schema Publisher and Query Resolver. And then also Helidon has support. And I do like that Helidon, you could tell it's kind of an Oracle product because of the links and how they do their documentation. I mean, what a terrible link that is, right? So you would think it would just be docs v2 like GraphQL or something, but there you go. So they all support it. Works great. And then if you wanted to use, you might have seen how I did the OAuth stuff, but you might want to know a bit more about that. So, trying to understand OAuth, if you actually look at it from an outsider's view, it often feels like being trapped inside a maze of specs and trying to find your way out. And before you can finally do it, you actually set out to build your application, right? You're like, which of these specs should I use? And so that's why we actually started to develop OAuth 2 or 2.1. The main goal with OAuth 2.1 is to capture the current best practices in OAuth 2.0, as well as its well-established extensions under a single name. So the major differences from 2.0 are PKCE is required for all clients using the authorization code flow. PKCE stands for Proof Key for Code Exchange. So this even means clients that might have a client secret and be confidential, When we say confidential clients, we mean like a Spring Boot client that runs on a server that your users can't access to, right? Clients don't have access to it, like all the code's secure and running on the server, versus public clients, which might be like a mobile phone, right? Which you could probably jailbreak and get to the code if you really want it. Redirect URIs must be compared using exact string matches. And so if you're familiar with Keycloak, they allow wildcards. Actually, Okta recently added wildcards. So if you want to be OAuth 2.1 compliant, you will delete that feature and not use wildcards. And the whole reason for that is you just want to make everything more secure by specifying those, fully redirect URIs. The implicit grant is omitted. When OAuth 2, first came out, browsers didn't actually support XHR and, CORS, right? Cross origin resource sharing. So now they support it. The implicit grant will have it so your access token is returned in the URL. We don't do that anymore because those might show up in server logs. So, and then the resource owner password credentials grant is omitted. And so this was a way for old legacy clients like a Windows 3.1 machine to actually send, just a username and password to use OAuth. And if you're sending a username and password, like that's the whole point of OAuth. So it seems kind of weird that they even had it in the first place. But then, there's a couple other things on there. So, if you're doing something like this example and you're just doing a resource server, chances are you're doing, OAuth 2.1 because you're not using anything like, implicit grant or password grant. And so that's OAuth, which is different from OpenID Connect. So OAuth is very much, for delegated authorization versus OpenID Connect is for authentication. So you can actually know who the person is, because with OAuth, the access token can actually just be a random string of characters. So there is no more information than that, right? If you were to, decode it, you got a random string of characters. There's nothing there. And so some people have started using, JWTs for their access tokens. There's a bit more information there, but if there's like identity information in there, then you're doing it wrong. That's what ID tokens and OpenID Connect are for. So OpenID Connect builds on top of OAuth. It's, just a thin layer for that authentication. And all of the frameworks that I mentioned here do support OpenID Connect authentication. The thing I've noticed with Helidon is I haven't been able to get it working yet, but they do have a working example out there. So I am working with them to make it work, and I'll eventually, put out an example to show you how to do that. So you might be asking, what about testing? My answer there is no one writes tests. No, I'm just kidding. So the cool thing is with the native stuff, they've really been pretty innovative, but they've also been blocked by things. Mockito, for instance, didn't work with Spring Native up until recently, I think. And I haven't tried it, but that kind of, if like in JHipster, we use Mockito everywhere. So if Mockito didn't work, then, we weren't going to run tests with native. But if you use Spring Boot and like generate, everything and just, run NVM package and -p native, what it'll do is actually create a native executable of your tests as well. So with the new Mockito support, you could probably, use that and it would all work great. Quarkus also has a really handy thing in that generated app that I showed you earlier. They have a Hello Resource IT, and that actually extends the Hello Resource test that's there by default. And it has a Quarkus integration test annotation on it. And that's it. That's the whole class. So what that allows you to do is in native mode, actually run that same test. So pretty cool how they've made it, really easy. And then as far as like testing REST API endpoints with like a principal or certain roles, Spring Security has one of the best testing frameworks I've seen for that. So I think it can serve as a model for the others just because it's so full featured. You can mock JWTs, you can mock users, and it all just works nicely. So then if you wanted to build any of these with Docker, it's easy to just create a Docker file and specify, from OpenJDK and specify where you created that jar at, and then copy it in there, expose 8080, and, use java-jar to start everything up. And so that's your Docker file. And then to build it, you just use docker build -t and whatever tag name you want to give it, and then you run it. And so all that, it's pretty nice if you're just using regular Docker, but people have kind of gotten away from Docker files. In the Java community anyway, there's Jib, which people are fans of, and there's Maven and Gradle plugins. So the cool thing about those is they just read what's already in your pom.xml or your build.gradle file, and then you can just use regular Maven commands to do it. I don't know if you can see my cat's tail here, but she's walking on my desk trying to block my screen. I'm going to have to kick you off, kitty. She's a Siamese, so We'll let her have a view there. Bye. And then we'll kick her off. Bye. So use MVM verify to run all your tests, of course, and then gib build. And if you have a Docker daemon running and you want to, publish it to that, you can do it. And it even allows you to actually publish straight to a Docker registry. And then you might be wondering, well, what about these frameworks? Do they have anything, for gib or for Docker built in? So Micronaut does support gib, but you must configure a plugin for it. Quarkus generates 4 different Docker-related files. So they have JVM mode, legacy jar, and then native and native micro. And the native micro is like, how small can I be kind of thing. And then Quarkus plus gib, you can add that extension if you want. Spring Boot has built-in Docker support, and they've done something pretty cool with build packs that allow you to layer everything. So they have a layer of dependencies for your regular release dependencies. They have a layer for snapshot dependencies. They have resources for your static resources, and then your application. So what that allows you to do is basically build faster, right? So the first time it might take a while, but the second time it's much faster. And then to build with Helidon, it generates 3 Docker-related files. I got a typo in my slides there. I need to fix that. So there's a Docker file. There's one for JLink, and then there's one for GraalVM. And then Helidon plus gib, I couldn't find anything. So if they actually support it, it's just not documented. And I didn't try it, but, maybe it works because gib is supposed to be smart like that and know what's in your, pom.xml or build.gradle. And then so if you want to go native with GraalVM and Micronaut, you can use the Micronaut CLI. You create the app just like we did earlier. You can package it with native image, so you don't have to add any extensions. Just, it's going to have it in there by default. And then if you're using Gradle, you can use Gradle native image or Docker build native, and that'll actually use Docker to build it. So you don't need GraalVM locally to build it. And what I've found is, GraalVM builds take a while. So if you're going to build it locally, you might as well have GraalVM installed, because with a Spring Boot app, it takes 2 minutes, right? And 1 minute of that is a test. So if you want to skip the test, then you can do it in 1 minute. But then to do in Docker, it's 6 minutes. So 1 minute versus 6 minutes. It's obvious which one's better. If you want to use GraalVM and Quarkus, you would specify, when you're packaging it, -p native. And if you want, without GraalVM, use that native container build equals true. And that will, use Docker as well. And then build it with Docker like that and run it. So that's if you just wanted to build it with GraalVM, you can use -p native. And then start.spring.io, you do need Spring Native to add to your existing app. So it's different from Micronaut and Quarkus, where they have native built in. And with Spring Boot, you do need to go and get some plugins and profiles, from start.spring.io. So that's where that Explore feature comes in handy, where you can just go and grab those plugin configurations. And then you'll need to add some milestone repositories to your POM. And then you'll also need to add a Spring Native dependency. But if you use start.spring.io, it'll have it all in there. And then you can build it using boot build image. But that's, to use the Docker version, it is much better to use the -p native stuff. And so we posted this video. It's a recording of a live Twitch stream wherein Brian and I and Josh Long make Okta Spring Boot Starter work with Spring Native. So this was around, similar time to me publishing the Java native post, so June of 2021. And as of 2.1.1, the Spring Boot Starter only required that you enable HTTPS for it to work with GraalVM. And unfortunately, since then, Spring Native 0.1.1 broke our starter because environmental post-processor implementations are not invoked at build time. So that's unfortunate, but you can still use the regular Spring OAuth support, and that'll work just fine. And then GraalVM with Helidon, you can use Docker build and use their Docker file.native and run it. They don't have gib support, and as far as I can tell, you can just do nvm package, -p native as well. And so then to compare the native startup time performance with Helidon, 42 seconds, with Micronaut 29, you can see Quarkus is at 19.2 and 61 for Spring Boot. So this was on an Intel MacBook Pro, I think it was 2019, 64 gigs of RAM, which doesn't really matter for startup time. The disk speed is more important. but you can see Quarkus wins. But you know what I've noticed is every like month or two, I will, recompile these numbers, and they all seem to like go up a millisecond or two or down a millisecond or two. So there's not a lot of, stability for each framework on how fast they start up, but comparing them, like this graph always looks the same. Like no one's really getting faster or slower, like by a big wave between each release. So it's great to see the competition though. And then if you were to look at memory used after 5 requests, so just starting up the app and measuring memory is one thing, right? But hitting it with some requests is another thing. And so in the last year, when I've updated, for different versions, what I found is sometimes like the memory just keeps climbing, right? Like it's super low memory when you start out like 30 megs, but then as you hit it with requests, it like adds 10 megs each time. So I experienced that with Helidon, and I was like, hey guys, like, have you even tested this? And since they've optimized it, fixed it, right? You can see it's the same as Spring Boot and Micronaut pretty much there. And then Quarkus is one of the best performing from a memory perspective. And like I said, all these numbers are from a 2019 MacBook Pro. And today I'm using an M1 Max. So what I'd like to do is pause for questions, and then I'll go ahead and do a quick demo.
Right. So there's a couple questions, Matt, I've been saving along the way here. A few minutes ago, somebody asked about serialization. So we noticed that your examples are just strings. They're just hello worlds, which I love and all. But how about some JSON? Is there anything special you need to do?
No, they've all like included JSON by default, so that should work just fine. And I think if you have more complex, right, JSON or JPA or something like that, it could certainly throw a wrench into things. But this is similar to there's a major like benchmarking site out there. I forget what it's called, Tech Meme, or it can't be Tech Meme, right? The cat's back. But basically, it shows you, how fast various REST frameworks can be, and they just use strings, right, or barely anything at all. So I think that's why I kind of followed the same path here.
Cool. One more question. This was partially answered in the chat. Where'd it go? So how adaptive are these frameworks with the latest additions to the JDK, like virtual threads and structured concurrency? So that's some of the new fun that's coming out. Have you tried any of this with sort of the newer JVMs?
So the virtual thread thing is from Loom, right? And Loom, promises to make it so we can have, instead of 10,000 threads, you can have 100,000 or 1,000,000 threads or whatever. But it's funny because at first I thought, Loom is going to solve all our problems, so we could just use Spring MVC and we don't need like Spring WebFlex or anything. But the problem is you run into the same issue that Spring WebFlex ran into when they came out is, what about your database drivers, right? So if you have any sort of connectivity in your app, that needs to be non-blocking too, right? So if you spin up 100,000 threads and using regular old JDBC, like you got your bottleneck back, right? It's just at your database now instead of at your REST API. So I do think for the most part, unless you're doing threading code right now, it doesn't really affect most of us that do Java using frameworks. I think the frameworks themselves will leverage it, and then we can do that, right? But this is just a preview in Java 19. So it's probably not going to release till the next LTS 21. And then the frameworks aren't going to adopt it for a couple more years, right? So like we're a long ways off from seeing it, I think, in our frameworks and in our apps. And hopefully because of it, there will be more like reactive database drivers, right? Database drivers that are non-blocking. But the whole reactive, thing with the non-blocking really is going to help Loom more than hurt it. Like Loom's not going to replace it. They're actually going to leverage a lot of the reactive stuff that's already been built.
Awesome. So I think those are the big questions. If I missed something, ask it again, please. I'll apologize now in advance, but I think I've asked all the questions. So take away the demo.
So let me try to turn my mirroring on. Oh boy. Close that one down. So here we got the demo steps, and I'm not going to do all these. I just wanted to show you that they're here in case you want to do them all yourself and compare them all. So you'll start with generating or installing SDKman with Java 17, and then you'll generate an OAuth 2 access token. So we have the Okta CLI that allows you to easily do that and set up an account with Okta, and then you can create a SPA and set up an OIDC debugger app. That'll give you a client ID that then you can use on the OpenIDC debugger website. So if I was to go here, it's already, remembers my information from last time. And so I can just scroll down to the bottom and, click code there, click use Pixie, and make sure and specify this token URI, and then click send request. And this will do the Pixie dance once I'm logged in here. And then it'll give me an access token. So I got this access token here. And so if I'm to go to dev Okta, where I keep everything, native Java examples, what I do in that demo is I create everything from scratch, but they're already created here. So if I'm to open this up in IntelliJ, you can see all the code. Hopefully there's not too much indexing. Always a problem with IntelliJ. You're like, stop indexing. I just want to do a demo. So the first one is Micronaut, right? If we were to go and look at the source code for that, you can see that the controller is just like the one I created, 20 lines of code or so. And if we were to open up a terminal here and cd into Micronaut, I've already built it, right? Because you don't want to wait for me to build it with GraalVM. So if I do target, app, it'll start up. And if we were to look at, the resources, like I said, I used a properties file instead of a YAML file, but if you used to use YAML, you'll enable security. You'll specify the issuer there for claims validation, and then that JWKS URI. And this is something that's in there by default. So really you're just adding like this information. And then, it started up in 282. And what I found is that varies, right? Now we got 20 milliseconds, 18 milliseconds, 16 milliseconds, 17. An interesting thing is recording this like with StreamYard does make a huge impact on the Intel MacBook Pro that I have. But on the M1 Max, it doesn't seem to as much at all. So that's pretty slick. So if we were to go back here, we could specify our token, and then we could hit that endpoint. And it's all working, right? So that's Micronaut there. And then if we wanted to, test the memory, I have a shortcut for that. So functions memory is what I call it. You can see what it looks like there. So if I did memory and app is the name of it, you can see there 59 megs, right? So similar to what I had in my diagram. And then if we were to look at the next one, Quarkus, right? Close that one down. Hello resource, same code as I showed before. Application.properties. There's the microprofile JWT stuff. We're going to Quarkus, and the file name for this is Quarkus 1.0 snapshot runner. So kind of hard to see here with the cat in my way. 51 milliseconds there, 11 milliseconds, 12 milliseconds. So faster than Micronaut. And then if we wanted to test it out back here, use that access token, and then you'll see it's all working. And then if we wanted to do memory runner, whatever the executable is, you'll see 46 megs. If we hit it a couple more times, that could climb. Let's try it. 47. So not much, right? That's pretty good for Quarkus. And then Spring Boot, target demo. Starts up in 41 milliseconds. Try it a couple more times. 35, 41. It does do like 60 milliseconds on the Intel, so you can see it's almost twice as fast on M1 Max there. And then if we wanted to test it out, make sure it works. If we wanted to do memory on demo, we were at 77 megs. Hit it a couple more times and stays at 77. So once it gets to a certain point, it just kind of stays there. I did notice the memory goes up like 25% on the M1 versus the startup time goes down by like half. And then if we were to go to Helidon and target Helidon, this one, you can see the logging, right? Like they're hiding everything. The others do a little bit better logging. You have to find it out here. So 145 milliseconds, 34 milliseconds, 21. Oh, it's going down a lot. 22 at 22. So that's pretty slick. And then make sure it works with HTTP/IE. And then memory. And this one's called Helidon. You can see that's at 80 megs. If we hit it a couple more times, let's see if it climbs. 83. So not much, but yeah, that works pretty nice. Let me make sure I got all my steps. Yep. So that was just, a quick demo to show you, the how they all work, and you're welcome to, clone that repo yourself and try it out. So I do like to talk about the community for each of these. Let me unmirror here. So I have my speaker notes, but mostly in my speaker notes is the 1.0 release of these various frameworks. So, this section also is mostly pretty graphs. And so I do get some flack from people because they're like, those graphs don't mean anything. And that is true in some senses, but in some senses they do mean something. So I'll try to explain what I think each of them mean as we go along. But I want to point out release dates, right? Spring Boot 1.0, April 1st, 2014. So in the US, that's April Fool's Day. I'm not sure if that's everywhere in the world, but that's a bold move. I think Gmail was released on April Fool's Day as well, but 2014. Spring Cloud was released in 2015. That kind of kicked off microservices in Java as far as I'm concerned. But the next release of a major framework didn't come out until Micronaut 1.0 in October 2018. So that was a full 4 years later. And then Quarkus didn't come out till November 2019. And Helidon was that same year, February 2019. So, basically like Spring Boot had a pretty good head start. Micronaut had, a year head start before everyone else. And then, the late mover advantage, that's what Java has as well, was, Helidon and then Quarkus. And I like to think that Red Hat and Oracle both have armies of developers that they could dedicate to working on Helidon and Quarkus. I don't know if they do, but I imagine they have that capability. So on to the community aspects. Stack Overflow tags. When I look at Stack Overflow tags, what I think is there's a lot of people using this framework. And this goes back to the days when I did my Java web frameworks comparison. The Wicket guys, I used to have a slide. We didn't have Stack Overflow back then, right? We had mailing lists. So I would do mailing list traffic. And Struts was the Spring Boot of this slide. And the Wicket folks in like 2004 or 5 were like, it seems like most people have problems with struts, and that's why the mailing list has so much traffic, right? It's not that they're popular, that the community is huge. Well, then 2 years later, I update the slides, and it's Wicket that has the most, traffic. And I'm like, do you have the most problems? And they're like, no, we have the biggest community. So I do think it's a good sign of, the biggest community. So you can see that Spring Boot, early mover advantage, they have the biggest community. And everyone else, like, even Helidon, like on Stack Overflow, I don't know if the questions are getting answered in Oracle, but they've had 2 more questions since I last updated this slide right before Devoxx France, April 19th. So, not a lot of action going on Stack Overflow for them. And then GitHub stars, right? Spring Boot's got the most. And what I like to talk about here is I recorded these numbers in December 19th, 2022. And since then, Spring Boot has gone up 3,000 stars. The next closest one is Quarkus, and they've only gone up 1,100, right? So Spring Boot has like 3 times the growth that Quarkus does. Micronaut has only gone up 200. Helidon has gone up 200 as well. So you can see that growth is certainly behind Spring Boot. And if we look at the star growth, right, like they are certainly still trending up and to the right, versus the other ones are trending up, but they're flatter than Spring Boot is. And then jobs on Indeed is kind of crazy, right? So this is just in the US as far as I know. If there's another website, you want to look up and compare, you could certainly do that. The search terms I used are just Micronaut, Quarkus, Spring Boot, in quotes, and then Helidon. And there's a ton of people hiring for Spring Boot. Micro Profile, if you actually search for Micro Profile, there's only 6 in the entire US. So people aren't really hiring for that much. One thing I did notice that even since April 2019, or not 2019, but 2022 of this year, just a month and a week or 2 ago, there's been a drop in the Java jobs in general by 10,000, and even JavaScript, right? So there's 159,000 Java jobs, there's 126,000 JavaScript jobs. So we're beating them there. And then the funny thing is Kotlin has been steady. They only have 7,000, half of what Spring Boot is, but just some interesting stats there. Twitter followers, you can see that most people follow Spring Boot. And since December 3rd of 2021, the people that have gone up the most is Spring Boot. They have 8,100 new followers, in the last 6 months. The next closest one is Quarkus. They have 1,900. So that's like 4x the growth on Twitter for Spring Boot. And I just like to mention this site. I don't think they've updated in a while. Hopframeworks.com is a GitHub score, number of stars plus Stack Overflow score. And so this has, like you can see, React and Ruby on Rails and all that kind of thing in there. But when they last updated it, which I believe was Q1 2021, so a year ago, Spring was number 10 and JHipster was number 26 and nothing else ranks. I think that's mostly because, Micronaut, like Quarkus, they aren't really web frameworks. They're more API frameworks or REST frameworks, right? They do have the ability to do templating, but I just don't see people doing it a lot. And so you might be asking, well, Matt, you're a hipster, what about JHipster? Well, Spring Boot, we have support for that. We've had 240 releases. Our latest version is 7.8.1, and it's used by 46,000 projects on GitHub. And we also have Node.js and .NET Core blueprints, and there's even a Helidon blueprint under construction, but we do have a Micronaut blueprint, and we do have a Quarkus blueprint. So you can see they've only had, 18 releases, so quite a few from Micronaut there. The reason for the Micronaut one and all its success has been because the people that work on the Micronaut project actually contributed and helped out with it, so that was awesome. And then Quarkus, we still got some work to do there, getting up to the latest Quarkus release. You see my slide's not even up to date. 2.8 was the last time I updated it, so I need to put 2.9 in there, like using dev services, adding reactive microservices. So a little bit of work to do there. And then if you're interested in JHipster a bit more, check out my reactive Java microservices post. I also have one on Micronaut, just developing a monolith, and then Quarkus as well, and showing how we've built, the OIDC in there and how to use it with Okta and Keycloak. And I mentioned the M1 Max, which I'm using today. And this is from when I first, got it and installed like a version of GraalVM that worked on the M1. That wasn't fully released until the end of April, actually after DevOps. But what I noticed is still consistent, and that is the startup times are twice as fast, but the memory is a little bit higher. So I'm not sure why, but it is what it is. So, chances are that if you're running in production, you're probably not going to run on an M1 Max. That's a pretty expensive way to run your hardware, right? You probably do it on Linux, and I'm sure it'll be just fine. I don't know if there's going to be that much of a difference. So my thoughts on all the frameworks is basically Quarkus provides the best DevX. That's because, all you got to do is save files and it restarts, the server. And what I've heard from folks when I've shared this slide or shared these thoughts is like, Micronaut does that too. And guess what? I found a bug. And so it does now. But when I first, published these thoughts, it didn't, right? And I think that was, again, an example of the Maven plugin not being as good as their Gradle support. And so the startup time, memory usage, right? You can't argue that those are pretty impressive. And then Micronaut is the easiest to use, right? I've experienced the least amount of problems with them. I have experienced some, Maven issues lately, but for the most part, when I first started with all of them, it just worked. Spring Boot is the strongest community ecosystem and growth. The growth thing is something I only started tracking in the last 6 months, but yeah, it's still growing like 3 to 4 times faster than the other frameworks. And then Helidon has some catching up to do. I found a lot of performance issues, memory issues when I first started, and they've been quick to fix those. And it's nice to see that, the last time I started up there, 22 milliseconds. So, it's right on par with Micronaut there. And Spring 6 could be a game changer because they're rewriting Spring Framework as native, or native capable, just like the other frameworks, and getting rid of a lot of reflection, adding ahead of time compiling. So your build times might increase, but your run times will be super fast. And I have played with this same example and just upgraded like the top version number to 3.0.0 M3. And everything works from an OAuth perspective and a REST API perspective. I didn't try the native stuff, but as far as I know, I saw that demoed at Spring IO, and the native profile is in the parent POM. So you just have to specify a -p native, and it should build and work. So maybe that's an exercise for you to try today, or maybe I'll do it. And so if you're new to Java, I would say try Spring Boot because it has so much documentation and good Stack Overflow, like question and answers, and backwards compatibility. They do a really good job of making it so it doesn't break, things with major releases. And if you're familiar with Spring Boot, Micronaut and Quarkus both have migration paths. Even Micronaut has the ability for you to use the same annotations that you're familiar with from Spring. I'm not sure if Quarkus does, but maybe. But they've recognized that Spring Boot has a large community, and hey, if we can get those folks over to our side, then it's a good way to do it. Testing is important. Invest early and often, and quality is important. Take it seriously, and design your apps with security in mind. And use OpenID Connect if you can, because friends don't let friends write authentication. And so we have lots of tutorials on Java, Spring Boot, microservices, and JHipster on the Okta developer blog. And we have a few on Quarkus, Micronaut, and Helidon as well. And you can see the tags there, blog/tag/Java. So that's all of our Java posts. Well, if you want to see Quarkus's, you could just do tag/Quarkus or tags/Micronaut. And we are working on surfacing those tags, so you'll see them in the posts and you can get to them all easier. And then at Okta Dev there is our GitHub, Twitter, YouTube, and dev.to handle. And so I invite you to giddy up and use the source. Check out this repository, clone it. All the instructions are in the README to build it and test it. And you could even do the JSON stuff if you wanted and see if those times are much different. So thank you. We'll certainly have some time for questions after this. Keep in touch. If you want to take a screenshot of my contact information there, you can find me. And the presentation I actually uploaded to SpeakerDeck this morning, so you can see it there. I originally had the one that I updated in April, and I just replaced it with this one. I'll fix that thing about the number of Docker files for Helidon, and I'll re-upload it later. And then all the code that I write these days, you can find a lot of it on Okta Dev. So may the auth be with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So there's a couple comments in the chat at the end here. So from Eric, he definitely wanted to point out that the percentage of growth for Quarkus, it might actually be edging out over Spring. So I think watch out. Maybe we're starting to see the elbow of the curve graph, right?
Right.
All right. And so you said Micronaut had support for Spring annotations, I think.
Yes, I believe so. Yep.
So apparently Quarkus does too. So you were right. As well as Spring MVC, Spring Data GPA, and Spring Cloud Config. So thank you, Eric, for chiming in.
Nice.
All right, so we have a couple more minutes. I know we're a little over time, but I don't know what time it is where everyone is, but it's still early for me. So I've got all the time. So if anyone has some questions, drop them in the chat. And otherwise, we'll hang out for a minute here and then let you get back to your day. Douglas wants to know if you've tried something similar with VertX.
I have not, but as far as I know, like Quarkus and VertX are related, right? They're like Quarkus might be based off VertX, and so I like to think that what Quarkus is doing, VertX would be very similar. But no, I haven't tried it.
Awesome. All right, so I've got a couple of thanks you. Yes, Eric points out that Quarkus sits on top of VertX.
Yeah, and I think VertX was very popular, and we did a few posts on it. When we first started, Brian and I started here at Okta in 2017, and I think we had some early posts on it in 2017 and 18, and it really didn't have we track keywords, right? When we post blog posts and we track traffic on the blog posts, and VertX was kind of similar to Grails, where it seems popular in the Java community, but what we saw was not a whole lot of interest from people reading our blog versus Spring Boot blows up. But I realize that's a lot of my background too, right? I've been in the Spring community since 2004, and I haven't been as involved in the other community, so that could be related to that as well.
Awesome. Well, we've got a few other comments. People are thanking you, Matt. So I definitely want to thank you for your time, and everyone who asked questions and provided more information for us. That's awesome too. So thank you for engaging with us. And if you have any other questions, Matt, you want to throw your contact info back up here, and we'll call it a day.
Yeah, I can do that.
Oh, if I can find the right one to click on, maybe. There we go. All right. So if you have any questions, reach out. So our Twitter handles are under our faces anyway, but let us know what you think. If you have any questions, security related, topics related, Java related, just hit us up.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to say is, this is an exciting time in Java, right? Like it seemed like we had a couple of years there where, things kind of stagnated and there was Spring Boot and not much else. There was Vertex and Grails, but like I said, they didn't really get a lot of traction when we talked about them. And now, all these frameworks are kind of exciting. And the fact that, Brian and I have found some security related issues in them with OAuth is kind of, exciting that they fixed them so fast, right? So we've had very good luck with that. And I didn't show it, but I will right now. One of the things that we've added to the Okta CLI is you can actually do like Okta start Micronaut, and it'll actually create and configure a Micronaut app for you. I've got too many apps there, so I'd have to delete one. Apps. I got to pick one to delete. Who likes Angular anyway? Okta apps.
All right. So while you're doing that, Diego asked if anyone's found any issues with the Postgres client. I found some issues with Quarkus and the Postgres client related to connection management. Have you faced something similar? I think that's in general it's a very difficult topic to chat about, just based on the architecture of your application versus other applications, or if there's something obviously there could be a bug somewhere in a framework, but it could just be how you're running queries or anything. But if anyone has any comments or thoughts, definitely respond to Diego.
I can speak to what we've seen in JHipster, right? Because we've actually experienced like most of the issues we've seen in JHipster related to like Quarkus and Postgres or Spring Boot and reactive and stuff like that is often like low level like liquid base, right? Like liquid base, we found that if it's doing reactive JDBC, which is R2DBC with Postgres or MySQL or MariaDB, it can't like send null values or something like that. You have to send blank strings instead. So, there's different nuances like that, but we haven't actually seen anything with Quarkus and Postgres. And we do have, JHipster supports generating a Postgres app, with Quarkus. So I'm not sure. But at the same time, just to, clarify, like the blueprints that we have for Quarkus and Micronaut for JHipster received a lot of love in 2021, not so much love this year. And so I think that's because the people that were working on them, like maybe they got new jobs or, are no longer interested in Quarkus or whatnot. So personally, for me, that's something that I want to take on and make sure those blueprints get updated and are using, the latest versions, because they did work great at one time, right? So we just got to keep them updated and they should work great in the future.
Awesome. Well, that was quick. I should have known your demo here would have been seconds, right? But so you were able to create an app with one command. That's pretty slick.
Right. So we have Okta, start, Micronaut, Quarkus, Spring Boot, and Helidon. And if you were to go to HTTPS here, GitHub, Okta samples, that's where we keep them all. So you can see the source code for them, and they're very much based on the examples that I showed you today. The Micronaut, Helidon, and Spring Boot ones do have OIDC support, so you can actually log into those ones. The Helidon one doesn't yet. It's just an API that you can hit with a JWT. So I'll be doing a post on OAuth 2 support with all these frameworks, and then I'll do another post on OpenID Connect with all these frameworks as well. So look for that in the coming months.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're at time. I don't see any more questions. So once again, thanks, Matt, for doing this. And obviously, we're glad you no longer have COVID and you're still able to deliver this talk to everybody.
All right, and thank you everyone for taking the time today.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.